Welcome to the news for the week of 9 February 2020. The CIA spying? Could NASA have just used USB chargers in Apollo 11? Election technology not very secure. ICS is a threat. And the return of the Equifax Monster from beyond the grave. All this and more on Security Weekly News today.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week, your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. Make sure your team is prepared to fight off the latest cybersecurity threat. IT Pro TV is the resource to keep you and your IT team skills up to date. You can stream IT Pro TV courses live and on demand, so there's no need to send staff to off-site training. Team subscriptions include Pro Portal, so managers have full control over your team's training schedule. Go to itpro.tv/hack-naked and use the code HN30 to try it free for 7 days and receive 30% off your monthly membership.
Welcome to the Security Weekly News, episode number 11. I'm your host, Doug White. Let's get right to the news. For more than half a century, Crypto AG sold crypto devices to 120 countries, but it turns out that Crypto AG was owned by the CIA and West German intelligence, the BND. The operation was codenamed Thesaurus and later Rubicon, and was called the most audacious op in CIA history. The USSR and China apparently never purchased anything from Crypto AG because I guess they maybe knew something about it. So all the big baddies in the Cold War weren't really involved. But basically, the article says that 120 other countries, and this went on for a long time, that included all the allies of the United States, were using this equipment. So these were crypto devices that actually contained mechanisms so that the CIA and the BND could actually read all this messages. The article goes on and details all these different messages they got during the Falklands War and so on. Today, SWN International and Crypto International now own most of the assets of the company after it was dissolved. It was definitely a good read if you like crypto, and it really sounds like a James Bond plot in the making. So you may see that in the next James Bond movie or something like that. The next story was about Ben Nimmo. Ben is a Scotsman who basically targets misinformation bots on the internet and is basically a pioneer into how online disinformation campaigns actually work. A lot of comments from him about upcoming 2020 election campaigns in the United States, and he mentions that he's particularly worried about what he called hack and leak style operations, which are pretty much Snowden, the kind of things that were going on in the 2016 elections where people hack different groups and then they take that information and they slowly trickle out tidbits from it in an effort to sway people's opinions about various candidates and so on. A lot of that information is being sold. He's been targeted heavily by various groups, including Russian military groups who don't like him identifying and trying to suppress their bots. He was actually the target of a campaign last year where the bots themselves actually were all used to announce that he had died. And so there was all these news stories went out saying that he was dead. And of course, he had people calling up expressing sympathy to him, which is an interesting story about that. And if you're interested in election hacking of that ilk, Art Singer listed 5 things that needed to be done to limit the vulnerabilities listed in part 2 of his article. He had a part 1 of the article. I put links to both of them on the wiki so you can check them out. Basically using, what he recommended was using single-purpose systems, defense in depth, limit privileges, use multiple sources and audit them, and layered measured security. I don't think probably anybody listening to this is going to find any surprises in this article, and it's kind of sad that we have to actually sit down and say all these things to election officials. But Iowa, I mean, last week we certainly saw that underscored as they attempted to use apps that had security flaws, apps that had actual just operational flaws. And I think that we all probably are starting to feel that maybe some of our government infrastructure, especially at lower levels, is severely lacking in security basic hygiene. That story certainly underscores that, because they're basically telling them things that all of us have been saying to all of them for a long, long time. In the same light, Israel's entire voter registry was uploaded to an app called the Elector Voting Management App. Hard to say. Wait for it. The app had all sorts of security flaws, which basically meant that the data was exposed for days. So this was like everyone in Israel, like I don't know, it was 140 something million. The app was so bad that it actually allowed access via a really sophisticated hack called Chrome web browser. Really. I mean, basically 6.5 million records, which included voter ID numbers, personal information, all sorts of stuff, were all exposed for multiple days. The Chrome vulnerability, as I've been calling it, basically, which meant you could browse to it on the internet, was the most obvious issue that was used, but there were other security flaws as well in the app, and basically all these exploits added up to another case of an app that was being used that wasn't very well vetted, that resulted in a lot of data loss. Meanwhile, in the United States, Lockport High School in Lockport, New York, added facial recognition to its 8 schools in the Lockport School District. Now, some cities in the United States have passed laws against the use of facial recognition in order to prevent it. San Francisco, most notably, and I think somewhere in Massachusetts passed a law against this as well. But Lockport forged ahead, and the district's director of technology argued that this kind of technology would have prevented some of the attacks that have plagued schools in the United States for years. Opponents, and the article is really more about the opponents who have been trying to prevent them from doing this, talked a lot about privacy of their children, racial bias, which we all well know in facial recognition exists, and the accuracy of facial recognition overall, and generally overreaching in our security measures. So, my own personal opinion is that it is unlikely that this software works the way that the officials think it's going to work, because facial recognition is one of those things that's a lot like artificial intelligence and machine learning. It's something that gets marketed heavily as being this sort of panacea to all your woes. But my suspicion, based on all the interactions I've had, and I've never been to Lockhart, New York, but in other school districts, knowing that they often don't even have a tech person on staff, that it's a teacher, it may be an English teacher who got stuck with a job to manage this kind of technology. And the fact that they get hacked all the time, they get ransomware all the time, and the incidences of ransomware in school districts is just going through the roof, makes me start to think maybe they are not going to be able to manage this technology, even if it worked the way that they plan. Prove to me that you can secure your networks, and then maybe we can start talking about this other kind of stuff. My next story, please read about ICS. If you've never read about ICS, and you may have, this stuff is really scary. And I don't want to scare you, because it's not as scary as a lot of headlines like to make it sound. But basically, ICS are these long life systems that manage just about everything infrastructure related: water valves, traffic lights, electric grids, control rods and nuclear reactors. All these kind of things are managed by these very proprietary, sometimes, systems that were designed to last a long time. I mean, like 25 years. Some of this stuff out there is ancient, some of it's brand new, but one of the things that it all has in common, from my observation, is that a lot of it was never built with any sort of security in mind. It was built to do a job. It's an old school engineering approach where you just want to solve the problem. You didn't think about the security issue. It can even be analog. Think about like Rube Goldberg machines with pinball machine parts, and a guy named Lou with a monkey wrench who's down in the basement and makes sure the water wheel keeps turning. Yeah, well, that actually is fine. It's in some scenario. If Lou sees somebody creeping around the tunnel, he gets a monkey wrench and he goes down there and straightens it out. I mean, I'm not even making that whole thing up. His name wasn't Lou, but you get what I mean. But today, we started to see all these ICS systems getting added with connectivity to the networks. Sometimes it's just for reporting. and you see data diodes and things like that being used. Other times, companies are injecting blueprint monitors, blueprint sensors, Wi-Fi, you name it, and they're putting it into these antiquated systems for usually monitoring purposes and or updating. As you may guess, the security approach for a lot of these companies is the monkey wrench approach, and suddenly the whole network is exposed by a smart switch that runs the refrigerator. Really, really scary stuff. MITRE recently did release a version of the attack matrix that focuses just on critical systems. I did put a link to that in the wiki as well if you want to check it out. Just a quick shout out to ransomware, because we just really can't stop talking about it. I mean, and we need to. This article said ransomware is probably your biggest threat. I would tend to agree. The FBI had issued an alert in October that basically said that ransomware is going to be your biggest issue going forward. It's certainly devastating. We've seen that. It seems to be growing. The number of news stories I see every week now that are just about ransomware here, ransomware there, and so on, and it's very easy to do. All of us have probably experimented with it in our personal labs. I know I wrote some stuff in my lab, and I actually scared myself. But I wanted to give you an article that had a little bit of ammo, so when you go to upper management, maybe you can hang in there and argue for more funds. And then it is the return of the Equifax Monster. Back in 2017, Equifax was breached, and it exposed 145 million data items. Well, it's back, and it's in the news. Jason Wood is going to talk about that when we come back. So we'll take a brief break. You can stick around and listen to Jason tell us all about the Equifax indictment that came out this week.
As technology continues to evolve and expand, so have the countless ways our critical systems can be put in jeopardy. Ransomware attacks, misconfiguration, user error, and malicious threat actors, to name a few. As IT infrastructures continue to grow and diversify, how do you ensure stable security? Core Security, a help systems company, provides an analytics-driven, layered approach to security with a portfolio that enables both proactive and reactive responses. With Core Security, you can reduce risk by limiting access, detect upcoming and active threats, test for security weaknesses, and efficiently monitor data for actionable insights. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/core security.
We're back with the news and with the amazing Jason Wood, who has joined us today to talk about Equifax, thankfully, because somebody's got to. How's it going, Jason?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm pretty good. It's just another week of rain, but what are you gonna do? I know you live in the desert, but
Yeah. Actually, not too bad right now, but Equifax is definitely more on the menu for today
than the weather.
So as I'm sure many listeners noticed yesterday, the Department of Justice of the United States announced indictments against 4 Chinese soldiers in the People's Liberation Army and named them as responsible for the 2017 breach of Experian that Doug just mentioned. And as you probably recall, this is where pretty much every adult in the United States and about half the adults in the United Kingdom got free credit monitoring due to their data being compromised. The DOJ announced a 9-count indictment against 4 gentlemen whose names I'm not going to mangle up because I know I'm not going to pronounce it correctly. But they were all members of the PLA's 54th Research Institute. So some type of technology arm inside of the PLA. Obviously, the breach itself was huge. The reach into public was like I said, incredibly large. 145 million individuals inside the United States, and about half of the adults inside the UK, if I recall correctly. According to the indictment, the attackers went to great lengths to obviously obscure what they were doing, including routing their traffic through over 20 different countries and through 34 different systems. Some of the articles talked about how they were very careful every day to go back and delete log files and temporary files and things like that to clean up after themselves to avoid being detected. They made sure that their traffic looked like, they broke it up into smaller chunks so that the data they were copying out of the network looked like data as part of normal Experian operations, and made sure to use encryption so that nobody could identify this data in transit across the network. all of that was pretty interesting. One of the things I thought was interesting as part of the indictment, they have the pictures of 3 of the 4 individuals that have been indicted in their military uniforms. And, with the steps that they took to obscure their activities and whatnot, I'm really curious how they went back and pinned it on these 4 particular individuals. I'm assuming this is not just a technology investigation to get that kind of detail and identify these people. The reason for this, I thought was kind of interesting. According to Attorney General Barr, the reason or justification that the United States used to indict these individuals is due to the breach of or the wholesale collection, rather, of just ordinary citizens inside the United States. We're not talking about folks who are working with the government or defense contractors or anything like that. They just grabbed everything they could about the credits and personally identifiable information about ordinary citizens of the United States. And the U.S. does not regard us as legitimate targets for espionage. And I'll go ahead and quote this. This is the United States, like other nations, Barr says, has gathered intelligence throughout its history to ensure national security and foreign policy decision makers have access to timely, accurate, and insightful information. But we collect information only for legitimate national security purposes. We don't indiscriminately violate the privacy of ordinary citizens, end quote. So in other words, it's one thing to go after military, technology, and economic data, but it's another thing to steal bulk data about people whose only reason for being targeted is they happen to be U.S. citizens. Now, obviously, this could raise some objections by some folks, some of our listeners probably, that would point to U.S. intelligence programs that did target or have targeted U.S. citizens on some level to fight against terrorism and things like that. But regardless, this is where the United States has decided to draw a line. So what does this really mean to the 4 people who were indicted? Probably not much in their day-to-day lives. They're going to continue to go on and do their thing, work and whatnot, like the rest of us would. China is definitely not going to put them on an airplane to the U.S. So they can be arrested and stand trial. The operation is almost certainly approved by their leaders in China, in the military and government. And China wouldn't certainly admit any kind of responsibility for something like this. However, it does provide some risk to these men of being arrested. For example, if they were to travel internationally and pass through a country that decides to cooperate with the United States, they could be arrested then. For example, back in July 2014, the U.S. Secret Service arrested a Russian citizen named Roman Selensnev for his activities in credit card fraud operations, carding basically. And he was arrested while in the Maldives and was extradited to the United States. So it's entirely possible that these men could be traveling through a country that's more sympathetic to the U.S. than they expected, and that they could get nabbed there if one of them was to pass through. There would obviously be ramifications for that, though. We're arresting soldiers in the Chinese military for things that they did as part of their work there, and other countries may be a little bit more wary of providing that level of cooperation than just for a Russian citizen. China would almost certainly be expressing its outrage over the situation and look for ways to respond. So, for example, when Huawei's CFO was arrested in Canada for violating sanctions on Iran, China responded by arresting a Canadian couple that was in China. So you could see things like that happening if these 4 or one of these 4 were ever arrested. Events like this are definitely a little bit uncomfortable because we're watching nations try and figure out how to respond to this. And you can ask a lot of questions about what they're thinking, what their end goal is, what they're hoping to accomplish, what are they going to do if they actually do arrest somebody, things like that. It's just kind of the part of the world we live in now where we can reach out around the globe and conduct operations against your adversary, and then that other country then responds back, and everybody's just trying to figure out how to go about this. So this is kind of interesting to watch it develop. This isn't the first time that the United States has indicted a member of the Chinese government for activities like this. They did that a couple years ago as well. But we'll have to see where this is going to play out. It's obviously going to go over the course of years. What's China's response going to be to this indictment? Well, with what they have going on with coronavirus and other things, it's anybody's guess what they are going to do and how they're going to express their outrage back. Definitely something to watch. I've got the links here inside the show notes. They were definitely worth reading, in my opinion. Stay up on what's happening as countries, again, are grappling with these issues around espionage and cyber intrusions and things like that.
Thank you, Jason. Do you think we're subtle enough to have chosen 4 because it's an extremely unlucky number in China?
Oh, is it?
Well, to say 4 in Chinese is ci, and the character that precedes almost every word that involves death is ci. And so 4 is a very unlucky number in China. So maybe it was a secret hidden message in the whole thing.
Today I learned. If it was Eastern Europe, maybe we'd have gone with 13 then.
There you go. But in China, 4 is a very unlucky number. So an auspicious number, I don't know. I doubt we're that subtle, though, really. But you never know. We could have some people working up there going, hey, let's send them a little secret message in there. But why pick 5 when you could pick 4? Woo is so much luckier. But anyway, thanks, Jason. That's a great report on that story. Finally, in the news, Forrest Heller broke down the processing power in a USB charger. Particularly, he took Google's 18-watt Pixel charger, Huawei's 40-watt Supercharge, and the Anchor PowerPoint from Atom, and the Apollo 11 guidance computer, which was called the AGC. The AGC cranked out 1.024 megahertz in the processor, which was not very much because comparably the PowerPort Atom running at 48 megahertz had twice the RAM of the AGC. So he goes on to conclude that it's doubtful that these USB chargers could have withstood the rigors of outer space, the radiation, all the extreme condition. But he did estimate that if you took about 4 of those PowerPort chargers, you probably could have run the Apollo 11 and played video games at the same time. So now that Pace TR10 you've been keeping in the basement, just in case, somebody calls, probably not going to make a comeback anytime soon, but, who knows? Maybe NASA will consider USB power ports for their next mission. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Security Weekly News. I'll be back on Friday with the Security Weekly wrap-up. Thanks, Jason. We'll see you next time.